My fear is not that Greece is going to have another spasm like we had in 2010. My fear is that Europe has become a Greece writ large.
The idea that Greece is some kind of a role model for others, this is completely idiotic.
When the proverbial feces hit the proverbial fan, Germany's government will follow through by copying Greece's lethal so-called recovery playbook.
It's not so much a crisis that I see, it's more like a long-term, drawn-out decline.
Okay, today I'm going to go after an orthodoxy in which I have, as you will immediately see, a rather personal interest. On a week when Europe shot itself in the foot by sequestering Russian funds, we'll talk about this some other time, and don't forget that, the week when my successor in the Greek financial administration, the finance minister of Greece, was appointed chairman or president of the Eurogroup, I want to go after an orthodoxy, which is related to this last piece of news, the widespread belief that Greece, the sick person of Europe, has now fully recovered and shows the way for countries like Britain, Germany, France, Japan, even the United States, on how to get out of a debt-fueled crisis. So here is the current orthodoxy I shall wrestle with today. Greece, that's the orthodoxy, Greece is a heartwarming story of how the fallen can be redeemed, of how a financial pariah state can be rehabilitated. And as long as it takes its bitter medicine, the medicine prescribed by the West's top institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, the City of London, Wall Street, and so on, this pariah state can return to the fold of successful Western countries. More precisely, the official story is that Greece, which officially went bankrupt at least twice in 2012, and nearly left the Eurozone as a result, while I was its finance minister a little over, a decade ago. That Greece is now a shining example of how a country can not only escape its bankruptcy through scorching austerity, privatization, but can also recover fully, so much so that it is now growing faster than Germany and borrows more cheaply than France. This, I shall argue, is a scandalously misleading orthodoxy, based on truths. But Wolfgang, if it were just a question about Greece, I would not be choosing to dwell on it here, in the Econoclasts, whose audience has no reason to care much about my small, long-suffering country. No, the reason I'm talking about Greece today is that this false narrative of my country's success story is that it comes with a corollary that is particularly dangerous for the rest of the world. Now, what's this corollary? The corollary of the soothing narrative about Greece's spectacular recovery is that countries like the United Kingdom, or even Germany and Japan, countries that once looked with disdain at poor little Greece, must now learn from Greece and must follow its policies of austerity, deregulation, privatization, as they were practicing Greece, so as not to fall into a similar black hole to the one that nearly ate up my country. You heard the former Japanese Prime Minister say this. I read it in the Daily Telegraph about the United Kingdom. I see this policy recommendation everywhere, even the United States, by some mindless Democrats. And I have to tell you, Wolfgang, that it scares me a great deal. So let me get to the bottom of this. Why does it scare me? Why is the financial press celebrating Greece so boisterously? Because for a few years now, Greece is the money men's new El Dorado. They come to Greece, they buy a distressed mortgage, a non-performing loan for 5 to 10% of its face value, no more. They repossess the home or business. They sell it for 50% of the loan's face value, and presto, they have a tenfold return. Then they plow some of these returns into Greek government bonds to collect a nice little risk-free spread over German bonds, thanks to the European Central Bank's continued support of Greek government debt. Meanwhile, there's another game going on. Big business are also making a mint in Greece. I'll take as an example Fraport, a German majority state-owned company. Now, Fraport owns 14 of Greece's most lucrative airports, including Mykonos and Santorini, These are the gooses that lay golden eggs, as you can imagine. How did Fraport buy those 14 airports? With money lent by Greek banks, which Greek taxpayers recapitalized with huge loans from other European taxpayers. That's how Fraport bought those 14 lucrative airports, without paying a penny, not one penny, of its own money. Then, Fraport refurbished them. Where did the funding come from? It came from European money earmarked for Greece as part of the structural program. And now Fraport is collecting spectacular returns that are repatriated to Germany via Luxembourg. Meanwhile, we have a new debt bubble here in Greece that is powering real estate asset prices, which leads to seemingly real growth rates that are exceeding Germany's, definitely higher than the European Union's average. And that propels Greece back to the inanity of the debt-fueled mid-2000s, when the entire Western financial press, the same people who are now celebrating Greece's success story, they were celebrating Greece's arrival at Europe's hardcore a few years before the complete bankruptcy of Greece. Now, if you're in the business of using money to make money without producing any real new value, if you're a rent seeker, what is not to love about Greece? Greece is the apple of your eye. Why would you care about what is really going on in Greece's social economy? Why would you allow the grim reality that 80% of the Greeks are worse off today than they were even in the depths of the debt crisis 10 years ago? Why care that though national income in euros, nominal national income, is about the same as it was in 2009, aggregate disposable real income is 41% lower, and real wages are down 30%. And they have even fallen since the end of the pandemic in 2021. Why fret over citizens' arrears to the state, which used to be 22% of GDP in 2009, today it's 50% of GDP? Or over the exorbitant electricity prices charged by the ruthless cartel of crony businessmen following the privatization of Greek electricity. Or even the impossibility of making ends meet when wages that are the lowest in Europe, even below Bulgaria's, must now pay for basic goods whose prices are on average higher than in Germany, where rents have shot up 120%. So that's the truth behind the fairy tale of Greece's recovery. A paradise for rent seekers, a disaster for the Greeks. But as I said, Wolfgang, I would not be bothering you with this if it wasn't for the dangers that the Greek fairy tale entails for the rest of the world. Why is it dangerous? Because it ignores the sad fact that Greece's recovery is based on a new debt bubble. The same kind of bubble that pushed Greece into a black hole of debt in the first place. Put differently, Germany, France, and Japan would be committing suicide if they tried to emulate Greece's phony recovery through another debt bubble. And why? For reasons I'm sure you can explain to our audiences very eloquently.
Where I completely agree with you is that the idea that Greece is some kind of a role model for others, this is completely idiotic. We always see this role model discussion. Japan was a role model for the United States at one point until Japan busted. China isn't a role model and the US isn't a role model either. The US is not a role model for Europe and vice versa. And the EU is not a role model for the UK and vice versa. I'm afraid we are going down a similar debt trajectory path. We are indebted in Europe. Every country has raised its levels of debt, some quite dramatically, like Italy and France, some a little less dramatically in terms of the current stock of debt, like Germany, but fairly dramatically in terms of its trajectory. My calculations, if German growth remains as lackluster as it is now, because of a lot of reasons, and with current debt spending, they could be ending up with 140% debt to GDP quite easily by the 2040s. That would be higher than Greece. The debt bubble is, I think, a very, very likely scenario. Should it happen? Absolutely not. Because we're not spending this money on infrastructure, on research, on innovation, the kind of stuff that that you should spend debt on. Well, we had these discussions about debt-funded programs before. You don't spend debt on the army. You spend debt on investments, and you fund your expenses out of existing income. The EU is basically gone away from this principle. And that's a very dangerous trajectory. As for the rentier economy that you've so eloquently described in your comments, that is indeed a scandal that the operator of Germany's largest airport, Fraport, this stands for Frankfurt Airport, that they can basically reap these monopoly profits. This shows you that something is quite wrong about the way the bailout was handled, and this is usually a sign of. When stuff like that happens, it's usually a sign of something going wrong pretty badly going forward.
Well, it's beautiful that you and I come from Germany and from Greece. And we both are iconoclastic within the Greek bubble of economic talk. And that is because I think that the parallelisms between Greece and Germany are too close for comfort. There is a real parallelism between Greece and Germany, even though they are very vastly different economies, and it is this. You will recall that in the early 2000s, Greece had somehow persuaded the European Union, and I must say, against the advice that some of us were giving the European Union, the Greek governments persuaded the EU and the credit rating agencies of the private sector, let's not forget that unproductive investments, as you put it, which exceeded the European Union's debt limits, were a great idea. And they were perfectly well tolerated. There was no, this story that the Greek government somehow pulled the wool over the eyes of European officials is all rubbish. They did everything with the okay of Eurostat, of the Eurogroup, of Ecofin, of the German government. Today, something similar is happening. German's government, and you've written about this extensively, Germany's government, Berlin, has persuaded the Commission to factor in higher growth predictions into its calculations, even though those projections assumed the Commission's approval of massive new debts that are not productive. Now, the danger is that when the proverbial feces hit the proverbial fan, Germany's government will follow through by copying Greece's lethal so-called recovery playbook, embarking on swinging austerity. So first you have an unsustainable debt, and then you have unsustainable austerity, which further dampens investment. And my great fear is that you already have an investment strike in Germany. You've had it for years, and that will push German investment further down, and therefore the whole country is going to be in a doom loop, very similar to Greece's. That's my great fear as a Greek and a European, of course.
I think Germany is already in that doom loop. You've seen this, the austerity has killed investment. The rise in debt has not increased investment. The rise in debt is mostly an increase in consumption. You're absolutely right. The German government persuaded the Commission to raise its forecast for potential growth, almost doubling it from like 0.5% to 1%. Or 0.9%. The reality is that it's likely to weaken because there's no economic reforms that have any potential to increase economic growth. They're loading up the welfare system with more spending and more contingent claims that have to be funded mostly from employees, making labor more expensive to hire. They've overregulated their industries. To an extent that the problem these days is no longer workers versus management. The most conservative forces in Germany these days are management. It's not the idea of in Germany, if you just let the companies do what they want, they would do exactly what they're doing now. They would not invest. And that's sort of what happens in societies that for a long period of time have been sort of burdened themselves with excess bureaucracy. They flush the wrong type of people to the top. If you are sort of moderately gifted in Germany, like you're an engineer or a mathematician or really sort of bright star, your best bet is to leave. You're not going to have many chances in the system. It's pretty good for sort of people with average talents and a sort of a high demand for leisure. The system kind of caters to these people relatively efficiently still, but sort of for people who actually want to create something or who want to do something different, or for people even who create new parties, political parties, this is not a good country. It's very difficult to actually get out of the mainstream. So I think Germany is already on that trajectory. sector, and I agree, if they go for another austerity, which they will do at one point, it's not that they will have to do it. What they should be doing is they should be investing they have a bit of fiscal space. They should be investing this in technology and in innovation in universities. Do something with it. That's not happening. So the financial crisis will again lead to austerity. All it will do is it will accelerate their decline. I fear, if Greece goes through another of these debt episodes and a debt crisis, or say a private sector debt crisis, I think we could be having very similar discussions about the future of Greece and Europe as we had in 2012, and we both remember this in 2015. I think this is not, unless there is a structural shift in the economy, unless there's actually something going on, entrepreneurialism. I worry less about income, the real income. I think these adjustments happen, but I worry about the fact that the economic growth is mostly driven by debt and by asset speculation, and that's usually a sign that something is not quite right.
I would like you to comment on the following hypothesis of mine or thought. During the deflationary years from 2010, 2011, all the way to the end of the pandemic, we had a massive liquidity flood through quantitative easing and various other techniques, which was not being converted into productive investments. Now we have tightening because of the inflationary bout, and yet we have new debt being created, but it leaks out of the European Union, out of the Eurozone, because on the one hand, the Green Deal has gone. It is now finished. It was proven to be a figment of our imagination. The 800 billion that is going to go into, if it goes, into armaments and so on, this is going to create very few jobs for Leonardo in Italy, for Rheinmetall in Germany, compared to the jobs that are being lost as German capital primarily, but not just German capital, is fleeing to the United States. Ursula von der Leyen already pledged $700 billion worth of investments going, I don't know whether, with what mindset she did this, but anyway, already BASF and Bosch and BMW and Mercedes-Benz are investing in the United States. So there are these huge leakages. The problem we had during the deflationary time seems to be getting much greater now during inflationary and tightening times. And my fear is not that Greece is going to have another spasm like we had in 2010. My fear is that Europe has become a Greece writ large.
I agree with you that our quantitative easing, our monetary loosening failed. I also agree that the fiscal loosening failed, and this has some very troubling consequences. I was in the beginning in favor of QE. I thought it would be needed to get the economies going. What I completely misjudged, and pretty much else in this debate completely misjudged, was the effect it had on investment. That it did not improve investment at all, because it was compensated for by austerity. That was clearly as I described it at the time, the biggest economic policy error of my lifetime. That was the synchronized austerity in the Eurozone. Now that ended with the pandemic, and the synchronized austerity became into a synchronized fiscal expansion. But the fiscal expansion didn't sort of undo the damage. It basically led to countries making some very bad choices. This is a very difficult situation to get out of. I wouldn't have simple policy prescriptions available. They will all require significant changes, big changes to the way Europe not just is governed, but also the way it perceives itself. For example, I don't think that this sort of welfare state, which we always prided ourselves on, I don't think it is this type of policy is sustainable. There may, I think what governments need to do, for me, the most important thing is investment. Is the fact that we are not creating conditions for private and public sector investment. And the two go together. Public sector is much smaller than private sector. In Germany, the ratio is about 1 to 10. So we really need to focus on private sector investment. So why is Bosch and why is Mercedes investing in the United States? Well, it's quite simple. The US has imposed tariffs. Their products are not competitive with those tariffs, and they now relocate production to the United States. That makes sense. Even under Biden, that happened when he introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. So what Germany did, it ran huge current account surpluses in the last decade. at 1.8.5% of GDP. For a large country, this is absolutely enormous. But it also means that comes a crisis like the one we have, this is not sustainable and companies are relocating. And this decline, there's no sign of it ending. Germany still has a massive percentage, a larger percentage of industry to GDP than the UK or France. This could go on for another 10, 15, 20 years. And I will actually expect this to happen because I don't see any political forces in Germany to come up with another plan. Not necessarily a plan I like. Yeah, this isn't about whether my policies are right. There isn't a plan. That's why I think the scenario of we ending up like Greece is actually quite viable. We're not sort of like, we're not. It's not so much a crisis that I see. It's more like a long-term, drawn-out decline, and that is exacerbated by the fact that people are still very optimistic about Europe, especially pro-Europeans. This is sort of one of the things is that they always like to. When they talk about Europe, they always like to emphasize the positive things, and that usually means they don't have to do anything, and that means that the decline continues.
Well, to wrap it up, I have a difficult task for you, our fellow Econoclasts, our audience. You must choose between two clashing narratives. The official one, according to which Greece is showing the right path, the way to the right path for Germany, for Britain, for France, even Japan. According to which narrative, I'm just a sore loser, a failed finance minister, hell-bent on diminishing a great success story that followed my departure. That's one of the two narratives. There is the other one. Our iconoclastic analysis, at least mine, which points to something particularly rotten at the heart of the so-called Greek success story. An analysis that warns the rest of the West, for goodness sake, don't do it like Greece. So that's it for today, folks. Next week, we shall be responding, Wolfgang and I will be responding to questions that you have posed, you have sent our way.
Until then, don't forget to rate, like, and subscribe to the Econoclasts.